November 16th, 2022. A rented apartment in Brooklyn, 86 years old, alone. Vincent Asaro died quietly in his sleep. No bullets, no bombs in the driveway. No federal marshals at the door. The Bonanno capo who'd allegedly engineered the biggest cash robbery in American history slipped out of this world the way most wise guys never get to, in a bed without a fight. The neighbors didn't even know who he was. This wasn't supposed to happen. Asaro was supposed to die in a cell, or in a trunk, or face down on a Queens sidewalk with a quarter shoved in his mouth. He'd survived the Lufthansa massacre that killed almost everyone connected to that score. He'd survived Henry Hill turning rat. He'd survived his own cousin wearing a wire on him for 4 years. He'd survived a federal trial that should have buried him forever. And in the end, the thing that finally took him was age. Plain, boring, mortal age. This is the story of how an 80-year-old Bonanno capo walked out of a Brooklyn federal courthouse, a free man after being charged with the Lufthansa heist. How the prosecution played FBI tapes where Asaro called Henry Hill a piece of garbage and laughed about his death. How Burke's old crew, the few who were left, closed ranks so tight that no living witness would put Asaro at the airport that night. And how the mob protected one of its last living legends all the way to a natural death, even as the FBI burned through 40 years of investigation, trying to prove what everyone in Howard Beach already knew. But here's what makes this case different from every other Mafia trial of the last 20 years. The jury didn't acquit Asaro because they thought he was innocent. They acquitted him because the government couldn't connect the dots. And the reason they couldn't connect the dots was sitting right there in the courtroom, smiling under his white mustache. You want to understand how the old mob really worked? Watch how Vincent Asaro died free. Vincent Asaro was born in 1935 in Ozone Park, Queens. The neighborhood was Italian, Catholic, working class, and almost entirely connected. His father was a made man with the Bonannos. His grandfather had been a soldier before him. By the time Vincent was 10 years old, he wasn't choosing a life. The life had already chosen him. He grew up around John Gotti's people, around Jimmy Burke's crew, around the kind of men who treated the Aqueduct racetrack like a personal ATM. Howard Beach was their backyard. Robert's Lounge on Lefferts Boulevard was their conference room. The kid Vincent watched his father get pinched, watched his uncles do bids, watched the family eat well even when nobody had a job on paper. He learned the code before he learned to drive. Don't talk. Don't trust cops. Don't ever, ever go on the record. By his early 20s, he was running with Burke's airport crew, James Burke, Jimmy the Gent. The half-Irish, half-Italian psychopath who would later become the central figure in Nicholas Pileggi's Wise Guy and Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. Burke wasn't a made guy. He couldn't be. The blood wasn't right. But he earned more than most capos, and he killed more than most hit teams, and the Bonannos and the Luchases both fed off his crew like it was a private bank. Asaro was the bridge. He was the Bonanno presence in a crew that operated out of Lucchese turf. He was the official ear, the official taste, the official cut. When Burke moved cargo at John F. Kennedy Airport, a slice went up to the Bonanno administration through Vincent. When Burke needed a favor from another family, Vincent made the call. He wasn't the muscle. He wasn't the boss. He was the connective tissue. And by 1978, the connective tissue knew about something big. Lufthansa Cargo Terminal, Building 261. John F. Kennedy International Airport, Queens, New York. December 11th, 1978. 3:15 in the morning. 6 masked men with shotguns walked through a side door that should have been locked, controlled 10 night shift workers in under 4 minutes, and walked out with $5.875 million in untraceable American currency and $875,000 in jewelry, $6.75 million total, in 1978 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $30 million today. It was the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. The planning was surgical. The execution was flawless. The escape was clean. The FBI showed up to a crime scene with no fingerprints, no clear faces, no license plates, and a list of suspects everyone already knew but couldn't touch. Here's how the score actually came together. A Lufthansa cargo agent named Louis Werner had a gambling problem. Werner owed money to a bookmaker connected to Burke's crew. The bookmaker, Martin Krugman, ran a wig shop on Lefferts Boulevard, 2 blocks from Robert's Lounge. Krugman heard Werner mention that an unusually large shipment of American cash was sitting in the Lufthansa vault, cash being flown back to the United States after circulating through American military bases in West Germany. Werner knew the schedule. Werner knew the layout. Werner knew when the supervisor took his break. Krugman brought the information to Burke. Burke brought in his crew: Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Seppi, Paolo Licastri, Joe Manry, Frenchie McMahon, and, according to the FBI, Vincent Asaro. The split was supposed to flow upward through 3 families: the Luccheses through Paul Vario, the Bonannos through Asaro, and a tribute to the Gambinos for letting the thing happen in their neighborhood. The robbery itself took less than 7 minutes inside the building. The crew came in at 3:15 a.m., herded the workers into a corner, made one supervisor open the vault, loaded the cash and the jewelry onto a black van, and drove out the same gate they came in. No shots fired. No alarms tripped. Werner had given them the disable code. Within 48 hours, the bodies started dropping. Martin Krugman, the wig shop bookmaker who'd brought the score in, disappeared in January 1979. His body has never been found. Tommy DeSimone, the trigger-happy psychopath played by Joe Pesci in Goodfellas, vanished a few weeks later. Officially missing. Unofficially, he was killed for an unrelated mob beef, but the timing was convenient. Paolo Licastri was found shot in a Brooklyn lot. Joe Manry and Frenchie McMahon were found shot in a parked Buick. Richard Eaton, a cocaine dealer who'd cheated Burke out of laundering money, was found frozen in a meat truck. Teresa Ferrara, a hairdresser and mob girlfriend who knew too much, was found in pieces in a Toms River, New Jersey surf. Within 18 months, every person directly connected to the Lufthansa robbery, except for Burke, Asaro, and a handful of insulated planners, was dead. The FBI knew exactly what had happened. They just couldn't prove it. The witnesses kept turning into corpses. Then, in 1980, Henry Hill, a longtime associate of Burke's crew, got pinched on a drug case and flipped. Hill became the most famous government witness in American mob history. He testified against Burke. He testified against Paul Vario. He laid out the Lufthansa robbery from the inside. He told the FBI exactly who did what, who got paid, and who got killed. The only problem was, Hill had never been inside the cargo terminal that night. He was a hearsay witness on the actual robbery. He could tell the FBI what Burke had bragged about. He couldn't put any of them at the scene. Burke was convicted on other charges and died in prison in 1996. Paul Vario died in federal custody in 1988. Henry Hill went into witness protection, got kicked out for being a screw-up, drank himself into a permanent fog, and died on June 12, 2012. He was 69 years old. Liver failure, heart problems, 40 years of cocaine and informant guilt. And Vincent Asaro walked for 35 years. Here's where the story turns. Here's where the FBI made its long, patient play. Because the Bureau never forgot Lufthansa. Every special agent in the Eastern District knew the file. Every prosecutor who came up through the New York office wanted to be the one who finally cracked it. And the man they kept coming back to, the last living name from that crew, was Vincent Asaro. In the early 2000s, the FBI got their angle. Gaspare Valenti, Asaro's cousin, born into the same Howard Beach world, raised in the same kitchens, trusted with the same secrets. Valenti had financial problems. Valenti had stopped earning. Valenti was bitter that Asaro had never properly taken care of him. So Valenti went to the FBI and offered something nobody else could offer: access. Real, unfiltered, daily access to a Bonanno capo who had spent his entire life never saying anything important on a phone. For nearly 4 years, from 2010 through 2013, Gaspare Valenti wore a wire. He recorded hundreds of hours of conversation with Vincent Asaro, conversations in cars, conversations in social clubs, conversations in driveways and at kitchen tables. The FBI captured the actual voice of an old-school capo in his element, talking with a blood relative he had no reason to distrust. What the tapes captured was not a confession to the Lufthansa robbery. Asaro never said the words. He was too smart for that, even at his age, even with his cousin. What the tapes captured instead was an entire world view. The arrogance, the contempt for rats, the casual references to murder, and one particular conversation that became the emotional centerpiece of the eventual trial. In 2012, Henry Hill died, and the FBI captured Vincent Asaro reacting to the news. On tape, Asaro called Hill a piece of garbage. He laughed about Hill's death. He said it was a shame Hill had lived as long as he did. According to the recordings played in court, Asaro and the remnants of Burke's old crew, the ones still walking around in Howard Beach, made a coordinated decision. Nobody from the old neighborhood would go to Henry Hill's funeral. Not to pay respects, not to spit on the casket, nothing. Hill had violated the code so completely that he didn't deserve acknowledgement in death. Now, you have to understand what this captures. Henry Hill had been gone from the life for over 30 years. He was a broken old drunk in California. He was no threat to anyone. He was, in mob terms, already dead. But Asaro and the few remaining old-timers from Robert's Lounge still considered Hill's existence a personal insult. The hate was that deep. The code was that absolute, and the FBI got it on tape. The Bureau also captured Asaro talking about an unrelated 1969 murder, the killing of a man named Paul Katz, a suspected informant who'd been strangled with a dog chain. Asaro, on the recordings, allegedly admitted his involvement. He talked about helping bury the body in the basement of a house once owned by Burke. In 2013, the FBI dug up that basement at 102 20th Avenue in Ozone Park. They found human remains. They matched them to Paul Katz. On January 23, 2014, federal agents arrested Vincent Asaro at his home in Howard Beach. He was 78 years old. The indictment was a 35-year-old wish list: conspiracy in the Lufthansa robbery, the Paul Katz murder, racketeering, loan sharking, arson, the works. The case went to trial in October 2015 in the Eastern District of New York Federal Courthouse in Brooklyn. The prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorneys, walked in believing they had everything they needed. They had Gaspare Valenti, ready to testify. They had hundreds of hours of recordings. They had Henry Hill's prior statements. They had Salvatore Vitali, the former Bonanno underboss turned cooperator. They had Peter Zuccaro, a Gambino associate turned rat. They had bones in a basement. The defense team, led by attorneys Elizabeth Macedonio and Diane Ferroni, walked in with one strategy: attack the witnesses, make every cooperator look like a self-interested liar, and remind the jury that not a single piece of physical evidence placed Vincent Asaro inside that Lufthansa cargo terminal on December 11, 1978. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The prosecution played the tapes. Jurors heard Asaro's voice. Jurors heard him insult Hill's corpse. Jurors heard the casual cruelty of a man who'd spent 50 years deciding who lived and who died. Gaspare Valenti took the stand and walked the jury through 40 years of family secrets. Salvatore Vitali corroborated structural details about the Bonanno family. The remains of Paul Katz were entered into evidence. But here's the thing. Henry Hill was dead. Jimmy Burke was dead. Paul Verio was dead. Tommy DeSimone was dead. Every single person who could put Vincent Asaro inside that cargo terminal at 3:15 a.m. on December 11th, 1978, was in the ground. The only living witnesses the government had were cooperators, and every cooperator on that stand had a federal sentencing deal hanging over his head. The defense hammered that point like a piston. Why are you testifying? What did you get? How many lies have you told under oath before this one? On November 12th, 2015, the jury came back not guilty. On every count, the Lufthansa Heist, the Paul Katz murder, all of it. Vincent Asaro, 80 years old, walked out of the federal courthouse in Brooklyn a free man. He stepped onto the courthouse steps. He lit a cigarette. A reporter asked him how he felt. Asaro looked at the camera and said one word, shocked. Then he got into a car and went home to Howard Beach. The verdict stunned the prosecution. It stunned the FBI. It stunned half the press corps that had spent 35 years assuming Asaro would die in a cell. But it didn't stun the old-timers in Howard Beach, because they understood what the jury had quietly figured out. The government had built a case on the dead, on rats, on ghosts. The actual living evidence of Lufthansa had been systematically erased 40 years earlier, in the cold winter of 1979, when Jimmy Burke's crew started disappearing one by one. Asaro had been protected, in death and silence, by Burke's old crew. The men who'd never talked, the men who'd buried Krugman in a hole that's still unmarked. But the story didn't end there, because Vincent Asaro couldn't help himself. In 2017, less than 2 years after his acquittal, Asaro got arrested again, this time on a federal charge that he had ordered the road rage arson of a man's car in Howard Beach. Asaro had allegedly become enraged at a driver who'd cut him off in traffic in 2012. He'd allegedly tracked the man down, identified his car, and ordered associates of John Gotti Jr. to torch the vehicle. Just a Bonanno capo in his 70s, using made men to handle a road rage incident. This time, Asaro pleaded guilty. He couldn't fight it. The evidence was clean. In 2017, before a federal judge in the Eastern District, Vincent Asaro admitted to the arson conspiracy. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He was 82 years old. He served roughly 3.5 years before being released on compassionate grounds during the COVID-19 pandemic. He went back to Brooklyn, not Howard Beach this time, a rented apartment, quiet. Anonymous, the last living capo from the Burke era, walking around a neighborhood where nobody knew him, nobody owed him, and nobody was going to bury him in cement. On November 16th, 2022, Vincent Asaro died of natural causes. 86 years old. He outlived Henry Hill. He outlived Jimmy Burke by 26 years. He outlived every cooperator who'd ever testified against him. He outlived the prosecutors who'd indicted him. He outlived the era he came from. And here's the part nobody talks about. The mob, the actual modern remnants of the 5 families, did not kill Vincent Asaro. They didn't have to. By the time he came home from his arson sentence, there was nothing left to protect. The Lufthansa money was 40 years gone. The crew was extinct. The neighborhood had turned over. Howard Beach was no longer a Bonanno fortress. It was a suburb with a few old men in tracksuits drinking espresso at storefronts that used to mean something. The reason Burke's old crew protected Asaro to the grave wasn't loyalty in the romantic sense. It was math. Talking about Lufthansa meant talking about the murders that followed. Talking about the murders meant exposing the names that did them. Most of those names were related, by blood or marriage, to families that still lived in the neighborhood. To talk about Asaro was to indict your own father, your own uncle, your own grandfather. So nobody talked. Not in 1979, not in 2015, not at the funeral. The silence wasn't honor. It was self-preservation passed down 3 generations. What does the Vincent Asaro story tell us about the modern mafia? It tells us the code still works, but only in pockets. It tells us that federal prosecutions of historic mob cases are almost impossible when the witnesses have all been murdered by the people you're trying to convict. It tells us that even the FBI, with hundreds of hours of recordings and a cooperating cousin, cannot manufacture a confession out of an old man who learned at 6 years old never to say anything on a wire. And it tells us that the real legacy of Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa Heist isn't the money, it's the silence. Burke's crew killed everyone who could talk, and 40 years later, that silence was still the most valuable asset Vincent Asaro owned. Vincent Asaro spent 8 decades inside the most dangerous fraternity in American history. He earned, he killed, he sat with bosses. He survived federal indictments that would have ended any other man's life. He spit on the grave of Henry Hill and got it on tape. He lit a cigarette on the courthouse steps after beating the case of the century. He died in a rented bed in Brooklyn, alone, with no headlines, no obituary in the major papers, no ceremonial wake. That's the real ending of the Mafia story, not the glory, not the suitcase of cash on the kitchen table, not the maid ceremony with the burning saint card. Just an old man in an empty apartment, taking the last secret with him into the ground. Vincent Asaro beat the federal government, then he beat the mob. And then, finally, the only thing left beat him. Time. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment. What Mafia figure should we cover next?